Well, welcome to our last panel session of the day on the challenges of developing parent-facing accountability. I am actually Carole, Willis, not Lorraine Dearden, but Lorraine has got some science, so I'll sit here. I'm Chief Executive of the National Foundation for Educational Research, and I'll be chairing this session. We're going to be looking at the indicators available to parents and others which can potentially help them make decisions about which school to send their children to, and help them to challenge school performance. What measures should be available, and to what extent do parents really engage with them in any case? And we'll be setting this discussion in the broader context, looking at information as part of the wider accountability system. I'm delighted to welcome our speakers, Professor Lorraine Dearden, Julian, Astle and Anastasia Waal. Lorraine is Research Fellow at the Institute for Fiscal Studies and Professor of Economics and Social Statistics at the Institute of Education, UCL. She's published widely on measuring school performance, and perhaps more importantly is a school governor and the mother of 4 school-aged children. Julian is a public policy analyst and consultant. He was a special advisor to the last Deputy Prime Minister, Nick Clegg, and previous director of the think tank Centre Forum. And finally, Anastasia is a policy analyst and deputy director of the think tank Civitas. Her work centres on analysing social and economic trends and evaluating family and education policy. She's also a qualified primary school teacher and a regular contributor to broadcast and print media. And she also chairs the national family support charity Family Lives. So I'll hand over to Lorraine. What have I done? Sorry. Okay, so while we're waiting for my slides to come up, yes. So I've been looking at the issue of school performance for a long time, and as I'm also a school governor at a local state school in North London, and I'm the mother of 4 secondary school children who go to 3 different secondary schools. So that tells you how much information how useful these things are in terms of school choice. I've got 2 in a grammar school, 1 in a comprehensive, and 1 in a private school. So there you go. Mucked a bit up, but so it's very hard to. Never rely on PowerPoint slides. So what the government's tried to do, I mean, the history of measuring school performance actually goes back to the 1990s or even earlier, but there's sort of the first time that the government tried to. So basically, school league tables have been published since the 1990s, and most of the school performance measures, most of the information that was publicly available through the 1990s when these exams happened were just raw school results, whether it's Key Stage 1, Key Stage 2, at the end of primary school, Key Stage 4 GCSE, or Key Stage 5. And they were widely available were available, and the information, the only information that parents could access in the 1990s. Then there's been a lot of academic literature on how you measure school performance. You know, what parents want to know is if I, my child coming from my family with, a strength in maths, completely terrible at English, what school can I send which will actually add the most value, where he or she will succeed? And so the response to this was to try and come up with some sort of value-added model. Because the problem with, as being well documented in the literature, that raw test results tend to reflect more the underlying ability and background of the kids than they do actually the value being added by the school. So DFE started measuring value added
think I've got the data, it was about 2002, I think, or 2001, 2002. And basically, and it's had, I can count at least 5 different value-added models it's had since then. And basically it measures the average gain in achievement since entry into the school, taking into account baseline, at least baseline student achievement. And in some versions of the model, the contextualized value-added, it took into account actually background characteristics of the child. And there is no doubt that this introduction of having a value added, trying to measure the value added by the school, rather than just looking at the final results of the school, particularly in selective schools, is much better measure than was previously available. And but what these value added measures are is just an average for the school, what it assumes is that this average for the school is a good indicator of how your child will perform at the school. But there's been a history of literature which has shown that schools are differentially affected across the background of kids. And you can see this in the data. Every single value-added model that the DFE does, they calculate the value added at an individual level. For some schools, it's amazingly stable. They do well across the distribution. For others, particularly, my local comprehensive, which has a high proportion of very able students, adds significant value at the top of the distribution, is terrible for kids lower down. But and that matters if you've got a kid who hasn't got level 5 in both English and maths at Key Stage 2. This school is not as good as another comprehensive down the road, which does much better across the distribution. And there's been other documented problems with some of these value added. They're not particularly easy to understand. So what do parents want? Well, if the schools are differentially effective, which I think there's quite a bit of evidence that they are, then they want, as I said, they want to know what the school will offer their child. And this is virtually impossible to give reliable information on. So Raise Online, which I as a school governor can get access to for my school, does show you value added by prior ability. It's sort of three broad categories. And it has been available online on the BBC website, but I would say most parents would not understand what that measure tells them. And they probably don't even know which group that their child comes in. So there's lots of problems with these measures. They're not very stable. The difference between schools, even if the measures are different, are rarely statistically significant, because all these value-added models are estimated, and so they involve error. They're not very transparent. There is differential effectiveness, so if you average over the school, you don't know about that. And it's quite clear, and there's been a paper that Steve Machin and Kirsty Hansen did, that parents, quite often make their choices based on the raw test results, when we all know that this is a very, very bad measure of the school effectiveness. I've got a parent power, the time, newspapers publish this all the time. It's always based on raw results. Now, this is from 2009. It's just that you have to pay to get the Times Power list, and I had this downloaded from another time. But all the top schools are all selected grammar schools, and that tells you nothing about the effectiveness of schools. The kids coming into these schools are so much more able than the others, so it's got nothing to do with school. But so what do these measures do? They all have the same basic approach. They have some sort of baseline measure. On the basis of that baseline measure, they make a prediction of what you should get. Then they see what you actually got and see how different it is from the prediction. And then that's your value added, and then they average it over the school. But the way they do this, they've changed it 5 times. The way they measure the baseline changes. The models they use for the prediction changes, the way they measure the outcome changes, and as I said, it's changed 5 ways in the last 15 years, and it matters. So what I've just done here I've got the 2014-15 value-added model. And this average Key Stage 2 score is based on an average of what you got in maths, English and science. And then this Key Stage 4 measure, I've translated it to what the new the new Progress 8 is going to be on the scale. I've made the scales the same. But this is based on your best 8 subjects with a bonus for English and maths, which is what's currently used at the moment. Okay? So this is the prediction of what you should get given your level at Key Stage 2. Now then I've used the same students and done the 2013 model. So this is exactly the same score down here, but using the 2013 models, kids getting very low outcomes, are predicted completely different things. That's just because of the model used. It uses a regression model where it has independent effects for English and science. Then I go to the 2016-17 model. Now this one is not very different from the current model, but here your baseline is just based on how you do it in English reading and maths. You ignore science. And this is the new Progress 8 measure. And again, you can see this is exactly the same outcomes, but now there's a 20-point difference. 10 points is 8 points is the difference of getting an A star versus failing. These are huge differences, and so the models really impact on the predicted score, and they all involve error. In fact, it's not a perfect science. And I just sort of graphed the median line for each of these, and basically where the latest changes really put much more pressure on kids who are very low down on the distribution. And this matters for schools. So, value-added measures are very, very limited, in my opinion, in terms of telling parental choice. What I want to know, my child who got level 5 in English and maths, what you want to know is a school that for that very level, adds significantly above value added. And that same school will not necessarily be the one that's performing well there. But given the sample sizes that we're dealing with, you cannot identify, it's virtually impossible to identify schools which are significantly better at different levels. Virtually impossible. What you need to do is sort of average over a number of years, and then that might give you an accurate picture. But of course, that's the situation now. It's no prediction of what the school's going to be doing in 5 years when your child eventually comes out of Key Stage 4. So, it provides useful information, but it is, it's not that helpful for parents. So I'm going to stop.
Thank you very much, Lorraine.
Should I just ask a question for information?
Yeah.
Does the fact that they changed it 5 times mean they've improved on it all the time, or does it mean they don't know how to do it?
No. So what their argument was that the complicated model they had before was not very transparent. So they used a regression model and they based the prediction on what you got in English, maths and science. And they allowed English and maths to have a different effect on what they predicted you get. Now what they do is they just put you in 20 groups, do a local average. So a person comes into school, and at Key Stage 2 they got an average of 4.6, which in English and maths. And then if you have an average of 4.6, then you are expected to get whatever the average grade is. And so it's very transparent. There's 20 different groups. You can see what the expected outcome is at Key Stage 4. It's very simple for the school to calculate. And the trouble is that they re-estimate these averages every year. So I was just along at my school where I'm a governor, and they've now got the 2015 data, and all the averages have gone down. So their value added has just shot up, just because the model, and people did less well in GCSE exams last year. And so all the averages have come down and the value added's changed. So it's a moving target for schools. So the government has said that it might set these in advance, 2 or 3 years in advance. But, it's got lots of problems.
Thank you, Lorraine. Well, you seem to have broken the IT and I've broken the microphone. So I look forward to hearing, to seeing what Julian's going to do for us. Julian.
Thank you very much. I just want to pick up on one or two of the points that Lorraine made. I mean, I'm a believer in choice in public services, both because I think they are innately good, but also have technical benefits. But I want to argue the opposite side a little bit today, even if only to play devil's advocate, which is that I worry a little bit about the consequences of ill-informed parent choice on the system. If you think back to the list of the very best schools that Lorraine put up, Lorraine makes the point, doesn't really tell us anything at all, but the explanatory power of pupil characteristics of family background is so strong that actually, you can be a pretty unimpressive grammar school and still appear in that list. You can be a very, very impressive community school with a very challenging intake and get nowhere near that list. And so the accountability system, as it is taken most seriously by parents, which is on raw attainment data, serves actually neither to reward good teaching nor punish bad teaching, but simply to mask what is really going on. And that worries me a little bit, because if you think about middle-class parental behaviour, middle-class parents herd towards and away from certain schools, and if they are doing that on the basis of raw attainment data, and all the evidence suggests they do, that's very, very damaging from a system perspective. It may not damage the prospects of their own child, their private perspective, but from a social perspective, that's very, very damaging, because what you end up with is parents flocking to schools that may not actually be all that good at teaching, but still have good test results because they are socially exclusive institutions. And that makes the system as a whole more socially segregated than it was before. And that has all sorts of damaging consequences, but none of them are quite as damaging as the implications for teacher recruitment and retention. Because if the accountability system, as it operates in relation to parents, doesn't reward good teaching and doesn't punish bad teaching, and often does the opposite of that, what incentive is there for a hard-working and really gifted teacher to go into a really challenging school in a very, very deprived neighbourhood? And this isn't just a question of equity, although it is primarily about equity, it's also about efficiency. The allocation of our teaching staff across the system as a whole is all wrong. So my concern a little bit is that we've got in terms of parent-facing accountability, we've got a system that, although if you look at the way the government measures school effectiveness, it has evolved over the last 2 decades, is now actually pretty good. I'm kind of a strong supporter of Progress 8. I think it deals with a lot of the...
It's so close to what was originally done in 2001 too, it's not funny.
Yeah, they come round but a lot of the perverse incentives in the old accountability system, a lot of the gaming that we saw going on, I think will be tackled by Progress 8. So yes, I think the government is moving in the right direction. I think the administrative accountability system is becoming more sophisticated. But in terms of parent-facing accountability, I think, raw test scores, attainment, is still king. It drives everything. It leads to herding behaviour, particularly by middle-class parents, and that herding behaviour in turn makes the system as a whole more socially segregated, and I think that has all sorts of damaging effects, particularly for poor kids, but also for good teachers who have no incentive whatsoever to go into the schools where they're most needed. So, that being the case, and that there's a limit to how much you can change parental preference or prejudice, call it what you want, what can policymakers do about it? And I'll just leave you with a couple of thoughts, which is I think that in a very socially segregated system like England's, we probably will need to think far more radically going forward about 2 things. One, the admission system, and 2, about funding, and in particular the pupil premium. And I would argue for a much, much higher pupil premium to start to reverse the incentives which are putting the very best teachers into the most advantaged schools and the least deprived neighbourhoods. Thank you.
Thank you, Julian. So can I just check, are you suggesting that parent choice can't work because parents can't fully grasp the information that's available? Or are you suggesting that there are different measures or approaches to increase the effectiveness of that parent choice?
I'm not arguing that it can't work. In fact, I would never argue for a school system that seeks to nullify parent choice. I view parent choice through the prism of rights. It is simply that we need to be alive to the negative consequences on the system, rather than on the individual, but on the system as a whole, of parental preference which is driven by raw attainment, as it always has been. And you know, I think, as I said, I think Progress 8 is getting quite close to the way we should be measuring school effectiveness, but I don't believe for a second that something as complicated as Progress 8 is going to drive parental behaviour.
Thank you. Anastasia.
Thank you. Is this on? I think it is. Yep, loud and clear. I want to broaden out slightly to begin with and then really narrowed in on what I want to focus on, which is inspection. But just the concept of accountability, I think, is key here. I mean, it's such a controversial, and persistently controversial subject in the sense of what does it mean? Where are we gauging quality? Where are we trying to gauge quality? Is it an improvement mechanism or is it simply an assessment mechanism? How can schools be best held to account? Is that in terms of their accountability to teachers? Is it accountability to the Department for Education? Is it pupils? Is it parents? Do these work in sync or do they actually work in conflict with each other? And of course, ultimately, this big question of who is the bottom line in terms of accountability. Are we talking about the taxpayer or are we talking about the pupils? And actually, is having the pupils as the ultimate centre of accountability going to then work with all the other processes around accountability? And I suppose my point really is that parent-focused accountability is what has to be the focus, because frankly, if it's not parent-focused, then it isn't going to work in accountability terms. And why that is really is down to the complexity that we've seen with many forms of accountability, that are essentially not comprehensible unless you're an expert or unless you've delved into the data and understand it. Now, if that's the case, then in my mind, that accountability mechanism is failing. So just to think a bit more clearly about what it is we're trying to get from accountability, I'd say that really what we're looking for is a clear and active presentation of a school's provision. It's interesting that we've heard quite a lot about results so far, but actually, of course, a school day is going to entail an awful lot more than just the results, just the performance that's happening in the school. So accountability does, of course, include results, and they're hugely important, exam results, test results, but you need a much more detailed picture of the experience that a child has in the school, and also the experience that the teacher has in the school, that the parent has with the school. And just because these details can't be quantified doesn't mean that they don't need to be as forensically charted. And I think that's this big problem, that we're not very good at being able to imagine that qualitative data, essentially, is also important and also needs to be captured. And it's not touchy-feely stuff and add-ons that we're talking about when we don't talk about quantitative data. We're talking about essentials in a school that actually make up a huge proportion of that learning experience and those future outcomes. So when I talk about good accountability, I'm talking about clarity. I'm talking about specifically not rocket science, not complexity, as I say, because if they are complex and they are technocratic, then that's actually becoming a process of sort of encoding, which is going to be incomprehensible to most people and therefore is failing at exactly what, in my mind, it should be trying to do. So what is the best mechanism for accountability, for what I think we should be trying to capture in accountability terms? Inspection, school inspection. And what is about? This is about experiencing, observing, documenting the experiences of pupils, of teachers, and of parents, and what they get. In essence, it's really a collation of the evidence in its context, and crucially, it's in context, not just the external aspects. But what we're not getting from school inspection today is that detailed picture. What we're really getting, rather than parent-facing accountability, is what I would term compliance accountability. And just one of the many problems with the inspection system is that it's based on flawed data. So it's not just that there's too much of an emphasis on headline results in inspection. So there are parents thinking that Ofsted is actually giving them something to add to what they already can see for themselves, the exam and the test results. But no, it's replicating them. There's also a very big issue with not just the parameters and limitations that test and exam data necessarily has when it's working, but actually some intrinsic flaws that we've talked about a lot in the last, particularly 15 years, around, for example, teaching to the test, and issues around truncating the actual curriculum and learning experience in order to get better results. So what we have today with inspection is actually a very narrow, very on the cheap, although not value for money, crucially, replication of really essentially little more than the test and exam results. It's not a productive process, and it's not a development process in the sense that it's really not about next steps. It's about high stakes and high risk. And sadly, the shorter and sharper the Ofsted inspections have become, the more these issues have been exacerbated, because unhappily that sharpness has not denoted inspection's precision, it's actually denoted the school's experience of Ofsted. So to come to what I think we need to see in inspection, what we essentially need to see is an accountability mechanism which has the breadth of the experience that the child has in schools. And this is something that it sounds perhaps veering towards the utopian, but it is actually very achievable. I mean, the Independent Schools Inspectorate is not a perfect model in its inspections, but the very fact that they spend much longer in schools, the process is much more about looking at what's working and what's not working. It's about a follow-up afterwards. It crucially involves heads from other schools, as well as people just coming in and leaving the education system, as it were. But ultimately, it's very much about getting an experience of the school in the round. And ultimately, really, what I'm saying is that at the moment, the existing key school accountability mechanisms results in an unsound focus on unsound exam and test results, and that doesn't just distort accountability, it also distorts provision because of the very high stakes nature of inspection. And what parents want to know is what goes on day to day in the school, that they and the children obviously are getting out of it and what impact it will have. And in a setting that is becoming increasingly diverse, where there's greater heterogeneity, you need much better and much more comprehensive inspection. And if we don't have that, the effect is ultimately, and we've already seen some aspects of this coming out, schools not feeling that they're able to actually make the most of the opportunities that they have to be different, to have a particular ethos, to have a particular program and a particular curriculum, because they'll be penalised for this. So what we need to end, is ultimately expensive, intensive and comprehensive inspection if we're to have an accountability model that works for parents and that really ultimately works for pupils. Thank you.
Thank you, Anastasia. I don't think Michael Wilshaw's in the audience, but I'm sure he'll be watching this later. I had some questions, but we've only got about 10 minutes left for questions, so I'll throw it over to the audience. If you could indicate where you're from, I'm sorry you've been doing that all day, and your name, please. Emily.
Hello, I'm Emily. I work for the Department for Education. Thank you. I was just wondering if we could ever get to a measure that technically we're comfortable with as a measure of school effectiveness, and we thought parents could understand it, use it, trust it. Is it always going to be inherently flawed or limited as a tool because it's backward looking? And if so, what can we do about that? And are there kind of early warning signs or success signs? You know, if you're a parent thinking about your child starting secondary school, what will that school be like when they actually leave that school? So I'd be really interested in the panel's thoughts on that, the time lag issue.
Thanks, Emily. And I think Simon Burgess and Becky Allen have done some work on that a few years ago, looking at the limited predictive power of today's exam results. I'll take one or two other questions before I ask the panel to respond.
Hi, Menzies from LKMCO. Anastasia, I really welcome a lot of what you were saying, about most of it. One of the tensions with it and the difficulties, which I wonder if you've got any thoughts on, is that we've got this a tension between people wanting the system to be more objective and less subjectively based on inspectors' views, but at the same time we want this kind of depth and qualitative content. How do you marry those competing pressures?
Anyone else? Tim.
Tim Evans, I'm a trustee of CMRE. Do you think the time's come to abolish Ofsted now and come up with something completely new and more kind of consumer friendly? Nobody seems to like that phrase here, but I think it's probably about time. I'd be interested in the panel's views on that. Thank you.
Thank you. So we've got a question there about developing forward-looking measures, if that's possible. A couple of questions on inspection. Anastasia, do you want to say something about inspection?
Yeah, I mean, I think a lot of them, all these kind of questions sort of roll into one, in the sense that why I like inspection as a mechanism is because it isn't a single measure. I mean, it sounds like one, but it actually isn't. It's incorporating all of the elements of being able to scrutinise a school provision, such as results, such as feedback from parents, basically in the round. And I think that the problem in terms of what we're seeing about looking back at provision and looking at distortions tends to be because there is too much emphasis on one mechanism, one measure, and therefore it becomes basically very, very likely to be vulnerable to distortion. On Ofsted, I think probably it would need to be abolished in order to work again, because the brand has, I think, become so problematic and meaning such a particular thing that it otherwise, I think, wouldn't really be doable. It would seem disingenuous almost to come up with this is a new version of doing things, but actually it's the same. And I think in terms of how you get good inspection, it's very much about training. And we need to have this objectivity and the subjectivity tension. A lot of that is going to be about not having last chance inspections and never having one for the next 6 years or longer after that, and therefore the status quo is the status quo, but actually having that sense of responsiveness to when schools need inspections, but also making sure that there is a high standard of training. That's one of the biggest problems now. Again, it's on the cheap idea. The training that Ofsted inspectors have in many cases is really very problematic, and that's simply, in many cases, just to do with the amount of training that they have.
Thank you. Ray, do you have any thoughts on developing a forward-looking accountability?
I don't know. I'm sure there's other parents in the room. I'd love it if there was some sort of forward way where you could sort of say, if I've got twins who are both in year 8 and I sent them to different schools. It was one of the how do you know? When you're making the decision, it's based on gut instinct. You go around the schools. How do you do a forward-proof measure? Basing it on historical data. Just all that's what it tells you. It tells you for a cohort that's 6 years older, sort of using some crude measure, how schools compare, and you might be able to do it for the type of child you have, but it's not going to be a prediction for how your child is going to go. So, I don't think it's achievable. Having up-to-date inspection data again, that would be helpful. I've done a paper where I've looked at how good students are at predicting value added in schools. So there's the Rate My Teacher site. And basically, kids are very, very good at predicting, schools where there's bad teachers. So they're very good at sort of predicting the bottom 20%, but they're completely hopeless at sort of in terms of results, in distinguishing between, excellent, good, and media. So I don't know. Getting feedback from parents and students and stuff will fill in part of the picture, but it's very.
I think that you and Anastasia actually picked up on that wider set of information that parents use to make those choices, and the research that NfER has done as well supports the fact that parents are looking at ethos, they're looking at teacher qualifications, interestingly, and effective leadership, and those are all quite difficult things to try and put in a set of performance.
And then the head teacher leads the first, when the child's in year 7, and then it all changes.
Julian, did you want to add anything on those points?
I mean, just A word of warning, I think, is probably useful here, which is let's not make the best the enemy of the good. We've got a pretty good system in England, actually, and up around the world, people keep coming here to learn how to do an accountability system. It's not perfect. We've naturally focused on its shortcomings more than anything else. I don't think we'll ever have the perfect forward-looking, predictive system, which means that parents never make bad decisions on their children's behalf. But the systems we've got is not bad. I guess all I would say is that when you think about the amount of energy and worry and stress that parents, particularly middle-class parents, put into the issue of choosing schools for their kids and the lengths they will go to get their kids that foot up at the start, moving house and buying and fitting the system and believing in God and all the rest of it. If I had one key point, it is let's be aware of the impact that can have on the system as a whole in terms of exacerbating existing inequalities, which are already wider in this country than they are in many comparable countries. And let's not decide that because we have wide inequalities and because the expression of parental preference can exacerbate those inequalities, that somehow the choice is a bad thing. It isn't. We just need to think about how to design a system around it to deal with it, and that's why I come back to questions like the admission system and the funding system. If we're going to have a market which operates to the benefit of all, let's skew that market very deliberately in favour of kids from poorer families. Let's not have a level playing field, let's tilt that playing field with things like the pupil premium and think quite radically about how we do that.
Thank you. Other questions from the floor? Have you run out of energy after we've got a couple here. Yes,
sort of question, really, but more statement. I'm sorry to speak for my mouth again, really. I think I said too much there, but I just, I chaired the Commission on Assessment without levels. I just guess a few comments, really. First of all, about the statistics we've been looking at. I would question the sort of validity of a lot of the data on which these statistics have been based. I won't say any more than that. The representative behind might throw a stone at me, I don't know. But,
no, she's a good analyst.
A lot of the data is of very dubious quality and is very narrow. Secondly,
so what data?
The data that is used for raise online and performance tables and so on.
So the key stage 2 and key stage 1 tests.
Yes. Secondly, I don't think, although we're talking about parents at the moment, I don't think anybody really showed any, apart from Anastasia has, but any appreciation of the damage that those tables have done to the quality of teaching in our schools and the curriculum. It has narrowed down quite a lot of curriculum. Teachers have been driven to teach by the accountability, high-stakes accountability framework within which they're working. And they've not been able to teach as well as they most of them would like to. They've been driven by that system, that accountability system. And heads are now using it. They felt obliged to use it for performance management, for instance. And third, we're assessing the quality of teaching, we're to measure the progress made by a child, for instance, from one year to another. Anastasia, I think, is absolutely right about assessment, about inspection. This is the key to it. And I think we'll never be able to abolish league tables and performance tables and so on. We can work towards improving the quality of those tables and the quality of the data. But I think the key is in inspection and providing parents with reports which give them a real insight into the quality of teaching in the school, the experience children get in a very broad sense, not only the examination results, all the other things that go on in the curriculum beyond the examination results and the key stage results and so on. That's where the key lies. And I don't think it's an impossible ambition. There have been changes in the recent Ofsted framework, inspection framework. And I've spoken to heads this term, last term, who've had inspections, and one of them said to me, I spent 24 hours preparing data for the inspectors, and to my horror, they didn't want to see anything. When they came to school, all they wanted to do was to sit in the classrooms, observing what was going on in the classroom. Well, I see that as a good thing. He might have been disappointed at that moment, but I think There's a longer phone here, please, right? I'll stop people, sorry.
Thank you. I think the gentleman over here had one last question, and then we'll wrap up.
Hi. I think the reason Ofsted, well, one of the big reasons Ofsted seems to be in so much trouble, and they seem to be sort of floundering, is because they set up to produce these long reports about schools and to say lots of things about schools, and then all anybody ever cared about was the score. And the score has become the reason for Ofsted's existence, you know, outstanding, good, class improvement, etc. And it reduced this qualitative inspection to a score. And this is a bit of a crazy idea. I think part of the problem is that Ofsted inspectors are terrible at doing that, and it's a really hard thing to do, actually. And that they seem to be very inconsistent, and schools are going from 1 down to 3, to 2, down to 4. And a research interest of mine is pairwise comparisons, and it occurred to me that a crazy idea might just be to, rather than giving schools a score, go to 2 separate schools in close succession. I think you can see where I'm going here. And just sort of on a range of criteria say, well, that school was better than that one. That school was, you know, pairwise comparisons, and then there's a lot you can do with pairwise comparisons in terms of inference about quality, as long as there's some overlap where a school's been compared to several different schools. You could actually tell a lot about the national landscape of quality by just doing pairwise comparisons between schools. And of course, there would be the other effect of that, which was that each school would know which school to go to ask for advice about it being better.
Thank you. Now, I won't ask my panel to respond directly to those questions. I will ask them if they could just give a few brief summing up points, and if there are issues you want to pick up from the last 2 questions, then please do so. Lorraine, do you want to?
I mean, you know, I think it's incredibly difficult to do this well and in all the dimensions that we want, and I don't think pairwise comparisons is viable, because what you would want to do is take, you know, otherwise identical schools, taking in exactly the same sort of students in the broadest characteristic. Well, you can't make a comparison, because then, you know, what happens if you walk into a school where the kids are completely from a deprived background, and then there's a rich part of the neighbourhood? How do you make comparisons in terms of those? So you know, this is I
continue to debate over drinks.
You know, I think it's incredibly hard to do well. I think, you know, parents, you know, this is, you know, parents, you know, make choices, and as I said, I've made 3 different choices, and probably got it wrong each time. So it's very hard. I think, you know, the information is useful. I think what Anastasia is suggesting, you know, would give a much more balanced view. But again, it's still not going to tell you, you know, what the outcome is going to be for your child in 5 or 7 years' time. So it's very difficult.
Thank you. Julian.
Final thought. I mean, I've always believed in the wisdom of crowds over the sort of hoarded wisdom of the Whitehall expert, which is why I'm in favour of giving voice to parents. Interestingly, though, I do think we've seen more progress in Whitehall than we have done in parent understanding in recent years. I really do think, you know, you think of all the problems that you were alluding to with the narrowing of schools' focus in order to comply with the accountability framework and the inspection regime, focusing on particular pupils, borderline pupils, focusing on particular subjects, gaming it, you going for certain qualifications as a shortcut to ticking the box, you know, doing everything possible to hit the floor target, to get above the floor target. I think that Progress 8, as I say, is a really good piece of work. I'd like to pay tribute to Tim Leunig and others at the DFE. It's a really good piece of work. I think it tackles most of the problems that were present in the system. My bigger worry now is that, despite all that progress, the way parents behave will continue to be driven by the thing it's always been driven by, which is raw attainment, which tells us far more about the characteristics of the pupils than it does about the quality of the teaching and the instruction in that institution. That's my big one.
Thank you. Anastasia.
I suppose really that if accountability is something that needs to be invested in, you just can't do it quickly, dirtily and simply. And I think one of the problems with things like grading inspections, even, so to take that particular model, is that you're trying to pot it, you're trying to do it, you're trying to simplify it, and the point is that you need that detail. And I suppose really, when it comes to parent power, the subject around parent-facing accountability, this thing that's become fashionable again as a concept, I don't want to see parent power being actually DIY accountability. Parents, do your own accountability, finding out yourselves. I want to see parents having access to the necessary evidence so that then they can make decisions about either which school they choose for their children or whether the school that their children are in is doing well for their child. And they need to be given the information. That's quite simply what needs to be done, and I don't think there are any shortcuts to that.
Thank you very much. I think you join me in thanking our panel.